Hello, it's Richard Pears from FinextraTV, and today we're going to talk about the role of financial services industry addressing the biodiversity crisis. After a multi-year effort, the TNFD has launched their disclosure framework to the market just very recently. And to brief us on this milestone, and it really does feel like one, I think more so for Emily than the rest of us, but even so, but also what's its purpose, what's its intended impact? We're joined by Emily McKenzie. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Richard. Great to be here.
I know how busy you guys are, so really appreciate you spending the time with us. You're the technical director at the TNFD, Taskforce for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. I think you've got something like 400 market members endorsed by the G7, the G20, multiple governments, WWF, everybody is talking about the TNFD. Tell us, and those of us that might have slightly missed the story, who are TNFD? What are you trying to achieve?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, a real pleasure to be with you today. It's been a very busy 2 years, as you said, since you last spoke on this topic, I think, with our co-chair, David Craig. But let me give you a recap for those who are newer to it. So as you noted, TNFD is the acronym. It stands for the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, so inspired by our sister acronym, the TCFD, which focused on climate. It was launched a little over 2 years ago, back in 2021, and it is a global initiative led by the market, as you said, supported by governments, and then based on the science. That's a big part of my role as the technical director. With the mission to develop and deliver, as well as a huge milestone for me in the world, a risk management and disclosure framework that's specifically focused on helping organisations, both corporate and financial institutions, to report, but also to act on evolving nature-related risks and more broadly opportunities. And that's the focus. The ultimate aim of doing that deliverable is powerful because we aim by creating that framework and having it being used to significantly shift financial flows away from activities that are harming nature and towards activities that help nature to thrive. So it's a very collaborative endeavour. I won't go through all of our structures, but at the centre sits the task force that has 40 members. They're senior executives from corporates, financial institutions, but also market intermediaries, exchanges, credit rating agencies, and so on, from all around the world in all the major sectors that have significant impacts and dependencies on nature. So we're led by our two co-chairs. I think you spoke previously to David Craig. Elizabeth Marema is our other co-chair. And then around the edge, that sits at the centre, but to make sure we are science-based and highly collaborative, we've developed this with the market. So we actually have now over 1,200 members of our forum, and they're organisations that help the task force, the 40 members in their work, and they come from all sorts of organisations, academics, NGOs, other organisations in the market, and so on.
Fantastic, and that's just amazing, isn't it? That momentum. I think I was sort of in most of the meetings along the way in the forum, not in all the hard working side of things, but it's just been amazing to see that journey. Now, a lot of people would sort of say, well, how do you measure nature and biodiversity risk? So what is, tell us a bit more, unpack that TNFD frame for us.
Yeah, it's a big question on measurement. Yeah. So I won't go through all the technical details, but maybe I'll give you a bit of a sense of how it works. And I'll start by describing what the framework consists of, just to situate measurement in the framework itself. So at the heart of the TNFD framework sits a set of disclosure recommendations, just like TCFD. For those of your listeners who know TCFD and know its 2017 report was a big milestone, we've published in September the equivalent of that. So a document that sets out 14 recommended disclosures, 11 of which are directly built from and carry over from the TCFD's recommendations to encourage that integrated approach and to help people get started. That's what we've produced. But around that, because many in the market said this is a new topic, it's seen as highly complicated, don't just produce the recommended disclosures. We'll get stuck. So please help us more by producing guidance. So we also have a package of additional guidance, which is suggested. It's there to help if organisations want to use it on a number of different topics. And that includes, how do you assess nature-related issues in the first place? And that can support disclosure, but it could also just support decision making. And that's one of the things we always emphasize, I'm sure David emphasized with you, is we're not just about compliance and disclosure, but really about shifting finance, showing what's material to you and changing your decision making. So in all of that bundle, there is, and it's probably been one of the most challenging aspects of the last 2 years' work has been the focus on measurement. So how do we measure nature-related issues? And the reason it's been challenging is because we don't have an equivalent of the greenhouse gas protocol. I mean, we do have a lot we can learn from. There's a UN statistical standard. The system of environmental economic accounting has ecosystem accounting global standards. So we have things we can build on, but there's been nothing we can directly transplant for corporates and financial institutions. So we've built on the best of what's out there. And let me just try and describe it simply to you. So first of all, we've recognized that for nature, risks and indeed opportunities are both arise because of dependencies and impacts on nature. So how an organization impacts nature and biodiversity could be negative, could also be positive, and how they depend on them for a variety of different services is what creates those risks. So when you start with measurement, you begin by thinking about your dependencies and impacts before you get to your risks and opportunities. And we have guidance. This approach we've branded the LEAP approach, which walks through exactly how to do that. How do you begin to scope your assessment in a manageable way in the locate phase, evaluate your impacts and dependencies, and then assess your risks and opportunities. And then as you're doing all of that measurement, the big word is metrics, right? So this world works on what are the metrics I actually have to measure, not just the methodology for measurement. So quite a long time ago, I guess it was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, we did a big landscape assessment of metrics, and we got to, it may have been even before you spoke to David, about 3,000, and we said, right, that's enough. We're going to need a funnel here to get to something much more manageable, a smaller number. So we went through a very careful process with knowledge partners, with Taskforce and with others to think about a structure for that. And we've ended up, for disclosure, with a small set of 14 core global indicators. 9 of those relate to dependencies and impacts on nature, 5 relate to risks and opportunities. So at the smallest, for disclosure as under a comply or explain basis globally, that's where we've got to. But above that are sector metrics to create that comparability within sectors for investors. And there's a much larger set for assessment and for flexibility, because we know with nature it's very location specific, can be very sector specific. So we've tried to create that consistency, but also the flexibility to create meaningful material information, both for the organisation and for those they're disclosing to.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of guidance on this for people that are sort of feeling, wow, that's quite a lot, but it is, you know, an awesome process to get that down to those key indicators that you described. Now, I mean, when you started this journey a couple of years ago, you know, everybody was kind of going, well, I'm only just getting my head around climate change and measurement and TCFD, etc. I'll wait for nature. I mean, that was kind of the narrative, isn't it? But I mean, I don't think anybody is talking like that now. But what's your sense of the momentum, the resonance that you're seeing in the market for what you're doing?
Yeah, well, I've just been to the 3rd of our launches. We had a 4th, so there's more meetings coming in the month. My sense is that there is large and growing interest and attention to the theme of nature and biodiversity. And within that, there is a lot of attention, hopefully realistically calibrated for what can be achievable by one initiative, because we're just one part of a bigger jigsaw of action that's needed, but on TNFD, because as this rises up the agenda, it's a very practical way for financial institutions and corporates to begin to take action and to accelerate momentum. So we're definitely seeing that. I mean, I can give you evidence, and I think what we called our open innovation approach, this very collaborative way that we designed and developed the framework, has been powerful for that, because we've really co-created with many other organizations. So I think I already mentioned this. We have 1,200 members of the forum. It's growing all the time. We had 240 organizations do pilot testing, so where they tried out our early versions, also called beta versions.
Yeah.
And then just because we did it through an online, it was a slightly clunky platform in terms of the interface, but it was very powerful for allowing any organisation to give us feedback at any time as we were drafting. We had more than 750,000 views of our framework, more than 3,400 pieces of feedback from nearly 70 countries. So the breadth of and depth of interest has been really incredible for the last 2 years. And now, as I said, at these launches we're doing, it's sort of standing room only. And I'm really humbled by the positive reactions to what we've created. But I think that's been a product of the way we've done it, the process, because it's been, we couldn't have done it alone, right? We had to build on what was already out there. And we knew two of our principles were very important: to be scientifically credible, but also practical to implement. So that meant we had to work with the users as well to check it was going to be practical.
Yeah, I mean, coming from sort of 20 odd years at Microsoft and the days of when it was all developed in an ivory tower, and then it became collaborative design over through I just sort of saw the process and the case studies that came out of the testers, the pilot testers. It's just so helpful that for people to see that and make it real. I think examples of what's going on in reefs and goodness knows what else. So yeah, no, I very much congratulate you for that approach. I mean, as you go into the targets, 30 by 30, 50 by 50, etc. People are talking about nature positive by 2030. Can we sort of now, think about it more in the sort of, I don't know, make it real for someone? What is that going to feel like? What are people going to see? A bit like these case studies, TNFD plus a target for 30 by 30. What might that translate into in your wildest dreams?
Oh, yes. Well, let me just get a little bit technical before I try to visualize it. Yeah, I think this term nature positive by 2030 is really important, and there needs to be integrity to it. So I see it stemming from the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is sort of the equivalent of the Paris Agreement for nature. Yeah. That set out these global goals and targets for 2030 and a vision for 2050. And in a nutshell, it says, to 2030, we need to halt and reverse biodiversity loss to put nature on a path to recovery. The Global Biodiversity Framework doesn't use that term nature positive, but we at TNFD have been part of a group. I think there's 27 organisations involved that just back in September launched an initiative to promote this integrity and to define this term nature positive. And of course, that work still needs to be done. But in a nutshell, I think what we're looking for is net positive for nature and biodiversity by 2030 against a baseline, likely a 2020 baseline. So there needs to be more nature overall in the world, more and more diverse nature by 2030 than there was in 2020. And so what's that going to feel like? And maybe I can draw from my previous role when we worked on the Dasgupta review. For those who might be familiar with it, this was a review on the economics of biodiversity. We showed this image of the planet and how if we can reduce our demands on nature, these negative impacts, and increase its supply through conservation, restoration, regenerative activities, that should start the planet to fill up with nature and biodiversity, its diversity, rather than be emptying, which is what's currently happening. So how it will feel, we'll be filling up the tank, we'll be walking out and seeing and feeling cleaner air, cleaner water, more wildlife. Be a wonderful thing.
And will that, I mean, I didn't ask you this sort of when we were chatting beforehand, but will that be, in areas that are brownfield today in 2020, can I call it brownfield? You know what I mean? But we're still sort of, denuding, primary rainforest kind of thing. Where are we focusing the efforts into the places that are going to give us the best chance for regeneration, or is it across the board? Is there an aiming and targeting of where you put this effort?
Well, other organisations, conservation organisations, have done huge amounts of work on that, and I sort of look to them for their direction. But what we have done in TNFD is to say the nature is a very location specific as an issue. If you're thinking about it as an organisation, where your impacts and dependencies are and where the risks and opportunities happen must be in a context. Because, for example, if you're using a lot of water in an area with water stress, it's going to be much riskier than an area where water is plentiful and everybody is sort of on target to be keeping it within its safe usage. So within that context, we set out some criteria. So when you're disclosing it against TNFD, what would be what we call ecologically sensitive locations, and that looks at areas that are high in bird biodiversity, high integrity or rapid decline in integrity, high physical water risks, or areas that are very important for services to local communities. But your question's framed on an interesting topic, because does that mean that depleted areas, low integrity, aren't a priority. And of course, when you think about opportunities, sometimes restoration of those areas will still be very important. So I think you always need to think about it in context.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the reason I partly ask is because, you know, we're doing this focus on sustainable cities, and I kind of, you know, when I started it, I thought, well, that's kind of a, you know, there's a madness. How can you have a sustainable city? But, you know, because we consume so much in those cities, but also they extract from the rest of the world to be consumed in those cities. Actually, you know, it's a huge area of focus. But
and one thing, sorry, can I just give one because it's so interesting. One of the pieces of guidance we developed was around, everybody's familiar with sector guidance, that's been going on for years, right? But we're developing sector guidance, but we've also developed guidance on types of ecosystem, because actually your interaction is going to be very different if you're in a river and if you're in a lake, if you're in a deep part of the ocean or in a forest. But what I think has surprised people is that urban areas and industrialized systems and indeed sort of farming areas are still a type of ecosystem, and they can be very important for nature, not only because you know, of the things you mentioned where it might be around resource extraction, but also the diversity of those cities and the nature that can live within them. So it's really an important area and is just as relevant. I've had some in sectors like you know, real estate say, but Nate, this isn't a topic for me, nature. I said, it definitely is. And real estate and infrastructure is one of the sectors we're developing guidance on for that.
And it's not just parks and green roofs, it's the whole watershed and the way it holds up water and reduces flood and reduces urban heat situations. So it's all sorts of things. So it's so interesting. Now, people went through the TCFD talking about data, and they went, oh God, we haven't got the data, and we know there's just tons of data, but it is often not so much about the data, it's the insight, it's making it actionable. And that's obviously a lot of what you're trying to achieve, but give us your sense of where we are with that challenge, you know, with regard to data, the gaps, and what we need to achieve to give ourselves a better view of the risk and the opportunity.
Yeah, you do sometimes still hear people saying in the meetings I'm in, the conferences I'm in, there's not enough data available to measure nature. But I have to say fewer and fewer people are saying that. And I like to take some credit for TNFD's work in actually testing that hypothesis and finding that it was not really true. So back 2 years ago, we were hearing that repeated statement. So we said, right, because my hunch was it's not true. There's tons of data out there. So we did a landscape assessment of nature-related data and analytics, and we found there's plenty of data available. Of course, there are some gaps, but it's more about exactly what you were mentioning as consistency, decision relevance, and accessibility. So, you know, I think when we did that original landscape assessment, we did find some gaps. They're kind of what you would expect. Things like there's more for land than there is for ocean or fresh water. There's more for certain types in Europe and North America than in developing countries. There's more on forests and climate. There are things people get excited about. There's more data. So there are gaps for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But really, one of the main things we found, which was comforting for us because it's something we could help address, was this standardization. So there's tremendous variance in how people are measuring. And so the data, the output data is very different. People want to be able to have consistency. They want to know they can track, and this is going to be updated to track things change over time. There was a particular emphasis on spatial data, going back to what we spoke about earlier, this location-specific information. That's about data around sort of assets and operating areas and supply chains, but it's also about capacity, so having capacity in organizations to handle geospatial data really well. And then on state of nature data, so we differentiate between how you're driving impact. There's quite a lot on that from existing standards, but actual state of nature data about ecosystem condition and species and so on, still work to be done. So in a nutshell, I think we found there are gaps, but it's more around that consistency and decision relevance, and that's something we've tried to improve by creating a tools catalogue, by establishing something we called the nature-related data catalyst, which brings together about 130 data providers, I think, who meet with us to learn about the framework, so for that consistency, and with the users of the data to learn about, right, what needs to change, where are the gaps. So that's kind of, we hope, when we're seeing catalysing more innovation to address the gaps.
Yeah, that's it, and it is, you know, very much galvanizing. Once we get that sort of, you know, that human effort and onto it, then you can start to see the patterns and the insights and make the change, can't you? I mean, in a way, you spoke about some of the barriers there, but you know, what are the key barriers that you see for adoption for TNFD? What needs to be done?
Yeah, I think I'd highlight four. One, we've just spoken about, data. So although we're comforted that there's less extreme than people worry about, there's obviously still work to be done on data and analytics. Second would be on capacity. So we know many organisations feel they don't have the skills, experience, understanding in this area. I'm sure they will fast track. They you know, once they have a reason to build this, it will improve quickly. But even there are different parts of the market. Even audit and assurance firms, I think, have got capacity gaps. The organisations themselves, the consultants. So we need to address that. Third is more broadly, I mean, even before we get to building capacity, it's awareness.
Yeah.
So really understanding that this is an issue, that there's a real business case for acting on it, and that there's a practical set of recommendations you can already act on. And then I guess most sort of linked to that is, and TNFD's remained a voluntary market-led initiative, but I guess the rationale for some organisations will be, well, when it's mandatory, when the regulators get interested, then we'll turn to it, which we really hope won't be the case. We think organisations need to take action now in the expectation that will happen.
Absolutely.
But it's, I don't know if that's a barrier, but more kind of a gap in the evolution of how this will happen. Just like with TCFD, it starts voluntary, it moves into standards, moves into regulations over time.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to an investor in another event the other day, and they said, look, we really just look at it now, and we think if we're going to invest in a garment factory, which we know is water intensive, we know that it's putting itself into a place where the watershed is going to be struggling, as you've described, you know, we're going to call that a risk, and we're going to price that risk. So, you know, quite a few people are almost sort of, you know, making all the decision logic that you would wish to be seeing already without the need for regulation. So
great.
It's good to see. I'm sure there'll be more of those coming through. I mean, it feels churlish. It does feel churlish to ask you what next. You've only just landing this, and as you say, there's a lot of market adoption to be done. But what next?
Yes, well, we've only just walked a small part of the journey, right? Because there's no point in a framework and a set of recommendations and guidance if they're not used, and if they're not used ambitiously and to affect action and to affect that shift of finance that was the aim of TNFD in the first place. So we are, you know, all ready now and moving into already our next phase. And in a nutshell, it will be about encouraging and enabling that scaling of voluntary market adoption of the recommendations and of the guidance for the assessment, because, you know, it's very powerful to even have those internal assessments that give you those aha moments, like your investor, about this bit water being a real risk and pricing it in. So we're going to do that through our next phase work plan. It will be on increasing market awareness, engaging that broad range of relevant organisations and stakeholders, supporting capacity building efforts with partners. I mean, we won't do that alone. And within capacity building, that will be, of course, online and trainings and in-person trainings, but also continuing to work on the data analytics and guidance where we've got gaps. We don't have many gaps, but for example, sector guidance on transition planning, and we're still working on. And with data, I've maybe just call out one initiative we did a scoping study on data. We're going to continue to explore this idea of possibility for having a global public nature-related data facility. So we did a scoping study on this, which identified it might be needed, particularly for better data on nature, state of nature. So we're going to continue to consult on that, maybe do some blueprinting, pilot test the idea to see what might be feasible and needed.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, I can't think there's any other place to end other than to thank you for all the work you and the team are doing, because I know how hard you guys have been working. I've been sort of watching it from over a cup of hot coffee over my screen and seeing all of the great production and effort. But the best place, I suppose, for me to lead it is, where should people get started? And I think you do have some pretty good get started material.
We do. We have a guidance which is aptly called Getting Started. So That's the place to
I could have
begin.
planned that line.
No. So go to our website, go to guidance. There is a document called Getting Started with the TNFD's recommendations.
Yeah.
It's a short read, it's a clear read, it's very practical about just very practical steps you can take. And that builds on the insights from pilot testing from real organisations who've done it in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Get started. Thanks very much, Emily. I hope you and the team will come back and give us the next update. But for now, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure.